what an immense privilege it is to sit here in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim. And even though I'm not in Yerushalayim proper, I'm in a suburb of Yerushalayim, in the Harei Yehuda, in Gush Etzion. And just the privilege of being able to sit here and learn Torah together and enjoy the unique atmosphere and kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is something one should never lose it. It's something really that all of us as olim, some olim chadashim, some not so chadashim, I think all of us really feel it more acutely than many Israelis do. I know in my shiurim and drashas where which I give to Israeli audiences in Ivrit, and I sometimes speak about this topic, about what a tremendous privilege and zechus it is to live in this country, and they look at me sometimes a little bit puzzled. I think many of them feel a little bit that it's really quite a challenge and difficult and not so simple to live in this country, and maybe some of them in their heart wish they were living somewhere else. It's a very interesting thing that people are, it's important for all of us not to lose the feeling of the privilege and then not to lose the feeling of the uniqueness and to try and transmit it to our children and to the next generation. Here in Efrat, my audiences are largely Israeli audiences, even though they might have come originally from somewhere else. They've been here 40 years or so. And when I do mention this, they're not really on the page with this completely. But I think we can certainly identify with this feeling that I feel very acutely. And Bez Hashem, we should keep this feeling for a long time. Okay, we are learning, of course, Sefer Bereshis, and we were looking at the elements of Sefer Bereshis, which are foundational principles for the whole of Jewish life going forward in future generations. And we've been looking at Avraham Avinu and the two covenants that Avraham had in Parshas Lech Lecha. First, the covenant of the Bris Bein Habsarim, and then the covenant of the Bris Milah. What's interesting is that the covenant of the Bris Bein Habsarim is not entirely clear what is being promised to Avraham Avinu, which is new, that he hadn't been told before. But if you look at the text, Avraham Avinu is being told the pasuk that we say on the Haggadah and say the night. Really, what Avraham Avinu is being told, interestingly, is Golus. A very interesting thing that. On the one hand, the covenant with Avraham Avinu was Eretz Yisrael, and when he gets the Bris Milah, shortly afterwards, the Bris Milah is a covenant for Brit Olam, an everlasting covenant that his descendants will inherit the land of Israel. And as the Ramban incidentally actually says, what does it mean, Brit Olam? The Ramban has got an interpretation which is relevant to us. It says Brit Olam means that even though the Jewish people will at periods of history be exiled, they will always come back again. That is the content of the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Parshas Lech Lecha, that the Bris Milah is the Brit Olam. So it's very fascinating that Avraham Avinu is promised two seemingly not really contradictory things, but two really opposite promises. One promise is that Eretz Yisrael is the origin and will be the destination of Klal Yisrael, even if there are some periods of history where we are exiled from Israel. On the other hand, he's told that they're going into Golus. You shouldn't think that your children are going to live in Israel and stay there and build it up. No, they're going to go to Mitzrayim, they're going to suffer, they're going to go through slavery, Abba Me'os Shana, and it's very interesting. What could it possibly mean? What could it possibly mean that Avraham Avinu gets a promise of Golus? Why is that such a subject of, why would he need that promise? And why, in fact, is it that one of the big puzzles that Chazal and Gedolei Yisrael and Jewish philosophers have dealt with over the ages is, can we make sense of the fact that the Jewish people, on the one hand, are created and connected to Eretz Yisrael in a very powerful way, and on the other hand, they are repeatedly sent into exile. So I came across, there is a very interesting, there are lots of answers to this question. The Maharal of Prague 500 years ago wrote a whole book called Netzach Yisrael, dealing with Golus and Geula, and the whole relationship between Golus and Geula. And I'm not going to go into that sefer for the moment, but I will tell you something very interesting. And that is in connection with a topic that we started last week, which is connected to the Bris Milah, which is the topic of Giyur, the topic of conversion, of non-Jewish people converting into Klal Yisrael, and that Bris Milah became the most important element of the process of Giyur for men, combined with, of course, the mikveh, the Milah and Tevilah, the two halves, really, of the process of Giyur, combined with the Kabbalat HaMitzvot. So the whole process of Giyur can be summed up in three words, really. The first is Kabbalas HaMitzvot, accepting to live as a Jew. The second is Bris Milah for the male converts. And the third is Tevilah. And Bris Milah, Tevilah, and Kabbalas HaMitzvot, we looked at it last week, if I'm not mistaken. We looked at it last week as being modeled on Kabbalas HaTorah. Right? I think we looked at that, didn't we? That we looked at the Rambam who says in Hilchos Isurei Bia, chapter 13, when he discusses the laws of Gerus, there he says that the whole procedure in Jewish history of accepting Gerim is modeled on Har Sinai, which was the national Gerus of Klal Yisrael. That was a moment when Klal Yisrael were transformed into the Am Hashem. Before that, they were already Bnei Yisrael in the sense that they were genealogically descendants of Yisrael. Yisrael meaning Yaakov, right? They were descendants of Yaakov Avinu, and that's why they were called Bnei Yisrael even before Har Sinai. But after Har Sinai, they're not just Bnei Yisrael genealogically descendant from Yisrael, meaning Yaakov Avinu, but we are the people who accepted to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. In other words, a people with a new destiny, a new designation, and a different spiritual constitution, if you like. But what's interesting is, let's go back to this first covenant for a moment. Just want to speak about that because it's very fascinating. And that is that the covenant about Golus, right? And we mentioned, as I said, in the Haggadah, that the concept of Golus Mitzrayim was predestined. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ger Zarach, your children will be enslaved and be strangers in a strange land, and they'll have to go through the gates. So it's interesting to ask the question, what is it about Golus which is an important feature of Jewish history from a spiritual point of view? And of course, from one point of view, Jewish people being sent into Golus is often understood as a punishment for Klal Yisrael, right? When we sit on Tisha B'Av and we read the Kinnis and we read the story of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the Jewish people sent into Golus, the context is that the Golus is a punishment. That is one aspect of the Golus idea. But it can't be that is the whole reason, because Avraham Avinu gets this promise as a covenant in Parshas Lech Lecha, before there's any concept of punishment for anybody having done anything wrong. Why would Avraham Avinu, why would that be an intrinsic part of the covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And here there's some very interesting aspects to it. I'll just touch on one of them, and that is brought in by Tosfos. Tosfos is the commentary on the Talmud. And in the Talmud, particularly in Maseches Yevamos, those people who are into Daf Yomi are in the moment in the middle of Yevamos, arguably the hardest Masechta in Shas, Yevamos, extremely, extremely complicated. But there is in Yevamos 2 or 3 daf, Mem Hey, Mem Vav, Mem Zayin, which deal with conversion, which deal with Giyur and Gerus, and that is the classic source of all our halachas of Gerus are in the middle of Maseches Yevamos. In it, the Gemara makes a very interesting remark, which at first sight is very strange. The Gemara says, Kosher Gerim li Yisrael kesapachs, that actually the converts for Klal Yisrael are actually not a blessing. They are kosher, they're very, very hard, are a hardship. Accepting converts into the Jewish people is a hardship, and it uses the word kesapachas. Sapachas is part of tzoras. It's like a plague. In other words, it's a disaster for Klal Yisrael having a Gerim. And you think to yourself, what sense can we make of such a statement, given the fact that the Torah repeatedly tells us how sensitive we have to be to Gerim and how loving, es hager, how welcoming we have to be to Gerim. And I'm not sure if I learned it with you, but there's an amazing letter from the Rambam to Rabbi Ovadia Hager. In the letters the Rambam wrote to the Science. Did we learn that here in this year? Did we look at it? There's a letter to Rabbi Ovadia Hager where he gives Rabbi Ovadia Hager in the time of the Rambam, 850 years ago. He gives him a tremendous chizuk, and he tells him I think the Rambam says 36 times in the Torah is mentioned how sensitive we have to be to converts, and how appreciative we have to be, and how welcoming we have to be. So if the Torah tells us that we have to be welcoming and appreciative to Gerim, to a Ger and a Gioret, why would the Gemara say that the Gerim are a problem, that they are a hardship for Klal Yisrael? And this is a problem which Tosfos, who, the Ashkenaz Gedolei Yisrael living in the Middle Ages, they really focused on this very much. And they came up with a couple, with actually several answers. I'll just mention 3 answers they come up with, all of which have certain sources. I can't go into them now without learning the whole text there in Yevamos. One of them is that it says that a ger and a giores enters the Jewish people, but they don't have a maseres. In other words, because they don't have any sort of received wisdom from their parents and grandparents, they're not accustomed to living a life of Shabbos and Kashrus and Yom Kippur and Pesach. They're not accustomed to it. They will inevitably get it wrong. They'll inevitably make lots of mistakes. And other members of the Jewish people will learn from their mistakes. And that's what the Gemara means. When it says that in the concept of Gerus, there is an inherent problem, because we're welcoming newcomers into the Jewish people, but everybody knows it's complex living a Jewish life. It's complex knowing what it means, Shachris, Mincha, and Meirah, but what it means, Hilchos Shabbos, Hilchos Nida, Hilchos Kashrus, and Chometz and Pesach, and all these things, so many details. For a ger, I don't know if any of you have had the experience of trying to accompany a ger or a giores while they go through the learning curve of trying to absorb all the regulations and mitzvahs and halachas, but it is massive. It's a massive enterprise if you think about it. How can one really encompass even a small part of Jewish practice, starting from total zero? How does one start from zero and get enough knowledge to really be a practicing Jew? So Tosfos says one answer is inevitably they'll make mistakes, and by making mistakes, other people will watch them making mistakes and learn from them a wrong practice of Judaism, and that's what it means. In other words, Tosfos brings down a source which says that that's what the Gemara means. It doesn't mean, of course, that we don't want the Gerim. Of course, we want them. We have to look after them, and it's a big mitzvah, and to love Hafto es hager, a special mitzvah for Hafto es hager. I remember hearing from one of the Vishnitzer Rebbes many years ago, who got as a son-in-law a chassid from a different dynasty. I don't know if you know that the Hasidim like to marry within their own dynasty. Belzers marry Belzers and Satmars marry Satmars. Occasionally, there is a sort of what you might call a mixed marriage, right? For a Belzer to marry a Bobova Chassid is really crossing the lines, but it can work, provided. Anyhow, this I think it was a Belzer Rebbe, Bobova Rebbe, got as a son-in-law somebody from the Gera community. So somebody asked him, "What's it like? How are you managing with your new son-in-law who is a Gera Chassid?" So he says, "It gives me an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah v'ohavto es hager." V'ohavto es hager. This is a bit of a play on words here, but it's an interesting idea. In other words, in a sense, he, from his point of view, viewed the Gera Chassid. So it's a play on the word ger, right? You understand the Gera Chassidim and the ger. But actually, what he meant was that he's a stranger, in a sense, to lots of Al Minhagim, and I have to. It gives me an opportunity to practice my v'ohavto es hager abilities, right? I say this sometimes to some of my colleagues who find themselves in giving shiurim and teaching in communities which they're not familiar with, either Ashkenazim with Sfardim or Sfardim with Ashkenazim or Haredim with Dati Leumi. There are all sorts of combinations. And I always say to them, look, you must view this as an opportunity to practice Ahavas Yisrael. When you're in the company of people who have a different style of Yiddishkeit to you, that's an opportunity to practice, to have Ahavas Yisrael for people who are completely on your page and completely your colleagues and live with you and daven with you and dress the same way as you do and speak the same way as you do. That's not difficult. But if you're with people who do it differently, and it can annoy you that it's done differently, and yet you have to practice Ahavas Yisrael. There's a special mitzvah of after l'orecha kamoicha is a mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael, especially for people who are, in a sense, have a slightly a different version, right, of Jewish life. In my life, particularly, this is true between. I often find myself on the borderline between the Haredi world and the Dati Leumi world. I'm often teaching in a Haredi context, and then I'm teaching in a Dati Leumi context, and the borderline between them. And of course, they have 1,000 times more things in common than they have difference to each other. But yet they have some hashkafic differences, dressing differences, various different external attitudes which are different, and one of the challenges certainly of Medinat Israel is to overcome these challenges and to really exercise Ahavas Yisrael in the best way possible. I think I might have mentioned once before in this year. I don't remember anymore the personal experiences that I mentioned here in this year, but I do remember many years ago. It was my father, Zichron L'Orav, passed away 12 years ago, and I was in my year of Avelis, and I was in a hotel, and I went to the shul in the hotel, and there was a large group of Edot HaMizrach, I think like Moroccan or Iraqi Jews there who were davening. And I came in there, put on my tefillin, and davening started. And when it came to Kaddish, I said Kaddish. So they saw me saying Kaddish, and there wasn't anybody else saying Kaddish. So the Gabba comes up to me and says, well, maybe the Gabba was like one of the organizers of the whole Sephardi group, this Moroccan or Iraqi group, incidentally, we as ignorant Ashkenazi, we say things like Moroccans or Iraqis or as if they're the same thing. If you say that to a Moroccan or Iraqi, he'll go nuclear. That you've confused the Moroccans with the Iraqis or whatever. They consider themselves to be completely, totally different from each other. Anyhow, the point is, I said to him, look, it's no good me being a shliach tzibur here. You are all davening Nusach Edot HaMizrach. So I'll never forget that. He looked me in the eye and he said, Kulanu achim. That's what he said. I'll never forget it. Kulanu achim. That's what he said to me. We are all brothers. We are all part of the same fraternity. It's the same Rabbeinu Shalom. It's the same Torah. It's the same Shulchan Aruch. We are Kulanu Achim. He says, you know what? You daven your nusach, and we'll work around you. It's okay. We won't pass out from shock. You daven nusach Ashkenaz, daven nusach Ashkenaz. This shul is a hotel shul, doesn't have its own fixed nusach. You do your thing, and we'll work around it. But just the way he said Kulanu Achim, I thought that was a remarkable statement to make. In a situation where clearly we had differences of practice, right? We Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Edot HaMizrach. Anyway, why do I mention all this? Because the issue of Gerim is people coming in from outside, and they're not accustomed to all the ways that Klal Yisrael behave, and this is a challenge for us. And when you meet a Ger and a Giores, you have to go the extra mile to welcome them in. But Tosfos says the truth is that many of them get it wrong very often, and by getting it wrong, they become actually a bad example. And when the Gemara said that Gerim are a problem for us, that's what they meant. They meant they could be a bad example. So that's one school of thought that Tosfos brings down. Interestingly, just forgive me 1 second. Sorry. Interestingly, Tosfos then goes on to do something which it often does when, if you're familiar with how the commentary of Tosfos works, and that is he suddenly gives an explanation which is the diametrically opposite interpretation. In other words, Tosfos because the issue with Tosfos is Tosfos isn't the name of one man. Tosfos was a group of about 50 people spread out over about 200 years, living around the whole of Ashkenaz, right? And Tosfos is a edited collection of their questions and answers on the Gemara, and therefore you often have different schools of thought answering the same question with totally different answers. So he first brings down that answer, that they're a bad example, and then he says, and there's another school of thought, brings down one of the other Baalei Tosfos, who says exactly the opposite. He says the Ger and the Giores, when they enter Klal Yisrael, they are tremendously meticulous in every detail of halacha, right? Because they're newcomers. They don't know any chachmas, and if you're supposed to daven like this, you daven exactly like that. And you're supposed to keep halacha like this, and Shabbos, and whatever it is, Pesach, and Niddah, and Yom Kippur, whatever it is, they keep it actually to the last detail because they've learned it, and they're going to do it absolutely properly, right? So the other school of thought is that actually why are Gerim a problem for Klal Yisrael? Because they show us up. Because compared to the level of meticulous detail of the Ger, your regular member of Klal Yisrael appears to be a little bit less Yireh Shamayim. That's basically, so it's very interesting. You have a statement in the Gemara, which is a strange, and then you have totally opposite ways of explaining the meaning of that statement, and both are true. Both are true. In some circumstances, the Gerim are people who don't get it right and become bad examples, and in other cases, they are in fact immensely meticulous and knowledgeable, and are in fact, by comparison, a regular member of Klal Yisrael appears to be a bit apathetic or a bit unmotivated. And that is what the Gemara means. That's the second interpretation. But the third interpretation is the one that I think is connected to our topic. Our topic is Avraham Avinu having a covenant and being told that the Jewish people will inevitably go into Golus. Now, it's true that pasuk only speaks about Golus Mitzrayim, but Chazal understood that this pasuk referred to all the other exiles as well. The Golus into Bavel, into Egypt, into Europe, all the different Goluyos that Klal Yisrael have gone through, all the different Gilgulim that we've gone through the last 3,500 years, were all part of that covenant with Avraham Avinu. Why is Avraham being promised this? So it's interesting that Tosfos gives them a third reason. Why would the Gemara say that it's a hardship for the Jewish people to the presence of Gerim? So Tosfos says, because one of the important reasons why the Jewish people go into Golus is to inspire and collect all the Gerim and Geruses of the other nations to join Klal Yisrael. In other words, by living in France and living in India and living in Iraq and Babel, we come into contact with French, Iraqi, and Babylonian non-Jews who will see us, and a very small fraction of them will be attracted to Judaism and will convert in. And that's part of the goal of Golus, says Tosfos. Part of the goal of the whole presence of the Jewish people throughout the nations of the world is in order to collect, in mystical terms, right? The Arizal says it's to collect the sparks of Kedusha, which exist within the general non-spiritual and the tumah of the Goyim. Within the tumah of the Goyim, there is a few sparks of Kedusha. And if the Jewish people live there, we can extract those sparks. Who are those sparks? Those sparks are a handful of Gerim. In other words, it's an amazing thing there to think about. You know, that the Jewish people could be, if you like, destined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to live in, I don't know, France or Spain or England, whatever it is, for centuries. And the whole goal is only to accumulate a handful of Gerim and Geruses into Klal Yisrael, and that is of such supreme value that in some way it justifies the whole period of Golus for the Jewish people. This is a phenomenal, the more I think about it, whenever I come back to this idea, as I have many times, it's really quite mind-blowing that is really part of the goal of Klal Yisrael. The goal of Klal Yisrael is not just to be inward-looking and to protect the Klal Yisrael from alien influences, which is certainly true, but it's also to be, this is really in a sense, the concept of Or Lagoyim. Or Lagoyim in a sense means to be a model where there will be Jewish men, there will be non-Jewish men and women who will meet a Jew, like Rus met Naomi. Rus meets Naomi. She doesn't attend any shiurim. She doesn't suddenly get a philosophical enlightenment, Rus. She meets Naomi, and she lives with her mother-in-law for a short while, and she sees that Naomi is living a life of refinement and of purity and of kedusha and of emunah and of chesed, and she says, that's it. That's the life I've been looking for. And she converts. So Rus is an example of somebody who, in other words, the whole expedition of Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons into Moab, what was the point of it? What was the goal of it? The goal of it was that this neshama of Naomi, of Rus, should be switched on. And once she's switched on, she joins Klal Yisrael, and that's the goal. So we don't understand really the machshavas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Rabbi Wein occasionally says, God hasn't spoken to me recently to explain exactly why he does things the way he does. I think I've heard this from Rabbi Wein a couple of times. I haven't recently spoken to the Almighty to get a perush about why he does things the way he does things. But that's clear that the concept of Golos, and it's a very interesting thing. On the one hand, the concept of Golos was a punishment for Klal Yisrael to be thrown out of Eretz Yisrael. But on the other hand, the Jewish people in Golos are on a mission. And the mission is to be an Or Lagoyim. And part of that, I'm not saying the whole of that mission, but part of that mission is that if there are individual men or women who see a Jewish person and a Jewish community, and they suddenly see the uniqueness and the amazing nature of the Jewish way of life, and they get switched on and convert, that was the tachlis. That was the purpose for which, so much so that Arizal writes, and he says throughout history, Jewish people have lived in certain countries for a few centuries, and then they've been expelled. So he says, on a Kabbalistic level, the reason for the expulsions of nations from various countries was because that's it. That there were no more Gerim or Gioruses in that country for them to attract. All the neshamas that were going to join the Jewish people had done so, and there wasn't any role for Klal Yisrael anymore in that country, and that's why they were expelled. From a Kabbalistic point of view, of course, expulsions were always a terrible suffering and a terrible poverty and terrible persecution. I'm not going to go into that for the moment, but he says from a mystical point of view, the trigger that triggers off the date of the expulsion is that there are no more nitzitzes, there are no more sparks in that nation where Klal Yisrael can in some way ignite them and attract them like a magnet to become part of Klal Yisrael. So here we find, so I think that is, here's an interesting thing, right? So just to review for 1 second, the Gemara said that the presence of Gerim for Klal Yisrael is a disaster, is a plague. And Tosfos gives 3 reasons. Either because the Ger doesn't know how to practice Judaism, becomes a bad example, or because he does it so well that he shows us up that by comparison, we're not doing a good job. Or what does the Gemara mean? It means that we, Klal Yisrael, have to suffer through Golus in order to attract Gerim. And that is what the Gemara means when it says Koshim Gerim LiYisrael. Koshim means that it's a hardship for us to endure the difficulties of living in Golus and the persecution of Golus, etc. And we are destined to do it because of our role as to attract the Gerim into Klal Yisrael. I find this it's very interesting. You've got like one Tosfos on a page in Gemara and Yevamos, and suddenly opens a whole sort of world of attitudes and understandings of complex relationships between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. But let's come back to Avraham Avinu for a minute. Why is it important for Avraham Avinu to get this first covenant of Bris Bein Habsarim? Why is that important? So what we're saying at the moment is he's being promised that his descendants will go into Golus, right? And the point of the Golus is to attract Gerim, right? Why is that important? Because Avraham Avinu sees his role on 2 different levels. Avraham Avinu is also the founding father of Am Yisrael, obviously, right? Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. But he's also the Av HaGerim. Avraham Avinu, every Ger and Giores is Ben Avraham or Bas Avraham. Avraham is the father of all future Gerim. And Avraham Avinu is concerned in his life to spread the light of Emunah and of Chesed, right? Avraham Avinu teaches 2 classes. Avraham Avinu's got a syllabus of 2 classes. He teaches Emunah and he teaches Chesed. That's Avraham's classes, right? And to whom does he teach it? To everybody who wants to listen. And as a result of which, he gathers around him lots of non-Jews who suddenly realize, gosh, a life of Emunah and Chesed is a life worth living, right? And that is his, and so HaKadosh Baruch is, on the one hand, he's promising him, you know what, you'll have a child, Yitzchak, and Yitzchak will have children, and there'll be a great nation. And Avraham Avinu is, according to this interpretation that I'm giving you now, Avraham Avinu is thinking to himself, well, that's very nice that I'm going to have a nation, but wait a minute, what about all the other nations of the world? What about all these other people that I'm dealing with every day? All the Umot HaOlam, all the nations of the world, are they spiritually lost forever? Will they not get a chance to live a life of mitzvot, to live a life of avodas Hashem, to live a life of emunah? Does that mean that the whole spiritual enterprise of mankind is going to be narrowed down into one very, very small sector of the Jewish people, right? The billions of people on planet Earth, how big is Klal Yisrael, right? Very, very tiny. The non-Jews actually don't believe that there's so few. If you ask an average non-Jew, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? judged by the amount of noise that we make on the international stage, right? They will tell you there must be at least 1 billion Jews in the world to make this possible. On a lighter note, I remember several years ago, the president of India, Modi, I think his name is, came to visit Israel. I don't know if you remember the visit of the Indian president or prime minister. He came to visit Israel, and we made a big fuss about it at a time when Bibi was still the prime minister. And there was a big press conference, which I watched on television. And at the press conference, they asked him why. I mean, India is one of the biggest countries in the world, 1.3 billion people, right? Why are you coming? Why are you so interested to come and visit Israel? So he says, what do you mean? Why am I so interested to come to visit Israel? We the Indians, we need Israel desperately. So they ask him, why do you need Israel? You know, you've got this massive country. So he's got a whole list. He says, we need Israel for satellite technology and medical research and irrigation technology. And he's got a whole list of a dozen things. He says, we can't manage our country without the input and the innovation of Israel. And everybody was aghast, you know, by how much a nation like India, you know, you look at the map, India is like this and Israel is like tiny. But I'll always remember one comment that Bibi and Netanyahu made at the time. So he's standing next to this fellow Modi, and then he says to the audience, he says, it's particularly important that Israel and India work well together, he says, because between the two of us, we represent 1/3 of the world's population. And I just thought that is real Jewish chutzpah. Like if there was ever a statement of Jewish chutzpah, that is Jewish chutzpah. You know, like India with 1.3 billion people and Israel with almost 8 or 9 million. You know, between us, we represent a large part of the world's population. That was Bibi's. It was a very good line. That was a very, very interesting line. And it was one of the things Bibi did best, actually, was interacting with world leaders on the world stage. That was really where he came into his own strength. And I miss him, actually, as a representative of, he made mistakes, lots of mistakes here in Israel, but certainly as a voice on the world stage, he was pretty much unequaled around the world. Everybody, all the other world leaders were a bit jealous of him. Anyhow, coming back to our topic, what's interesting is that we have in the covenant to Avraham Avinu, that Avraham Avinu has given a dual role. He's also the voice of Klal Yisrael, is the founding father of Klal Yisrael, but he's also Av Hamoin Goyim Nesaticha. The Pasuk says, you are going to be the father of all future Gerim. All future father, not in the genetic sense, but in the spiritual sense. You're going to be the spiritual father of every future Ger and Gioris. There's a Ben Avraham and a Bas Avraham. And that is, so why? Because of the Bris Bein Absarim. Because the Bris Bein Absarim told him that we're going to go into Golus, and we're going into Golus in order to switch on all those souls in the, all the neshamas of among the non-Jewish nations, which are receptive to hear the Jewish message. And there are many of them. There are many of them. Not all of them make the journey all the way to convert, but many of them are, in fact, very sympathetic and very interested and appreciative. This is, in fact, why, if you look at in the Chumash, we find Parshas Yisro. So Parshas Yisro is very interesting because the man Yisro is one of the famous examples, like Rus is in the Tanakh, so Yisro is in the Chumash. He is the classic Ger, right? It was mentioned also in last week's Parsha, that Avraham Avinu says to him, Alna, right, please come with us and become part of Klal Yisrael. And Yisro then becomes a Ger, and all his descendants are Gerim and join Klal Yisrael as Gerim. As newcomers, right? And he is somebody like Yishma Yisro. Yisro heard about Klal Yisrael, And says Rashi, Shama Uba. He heard about it, he understood what it meant, and he came to join Klal Yisrael. And that, in a sense, is something which we attribute to Avram Avinu. So this is what I'm saying to you about Sefer Bereshis. Sefer Bereshis contains potentially so many of the very, very important features of Jewish life going forward. And one of them is our goal, the goal of Klal Yisrael, to attract as many Gerim as we can. I'm talking about authentic Gerim, to join Klal Yisrael, to accept Torah and mitzvahs, and to become part of the nation. And this was part of Avram Avinu's mission in life, not only to be a founder of the Jewish people, but to be a collector of individual souls from among the nations of the world. Albeit that for us, for Klal Yisrael, it can be a suffering for all of the reasons that Tosfos brings. For all and any of those reasons, it can be a difficulty, but that's part of our destiny. Part of the destiny is the collection of ourselves. I just want to tell you something interesting halachically, which Rambam deals with. But in general, the Mishnah also deals with it in one or two places, and Chazal. Here's an interesting question for you. Let's say you have somebody who is a ger or a gioris. What does that mean? They come from a different nation, and they have different ancestry to us. Okay, fine. And then they convert and they're from and everything, and you give them a siddur, right? So the Gemara asks the following question: is a ger allowed to say Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, v'Elokei Yaakov? Have you ever thought of that question? Is a ger allowed to stand in davening and say that to address HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the God of our fathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Right? Is he allowed to say in benching, No Delecha Hashem Elokeinu, Asher Nachaltu La'avoseinu, Eretz Chem D'Tov Rechava? Can a ger or a gioris say that Eretz Yisrael is a land that was given La'avoseinu, to our ancestors, a wonderful land? In other words, all the references to Avoseinu in our tefillos seem on the face of it to be something which a ger or a gioris is unable to say. And indeed, there are a couple of opinions in the Yerushalmi who take the view that a ger and a gioris can't say that. They have to say something else, right? Elokeinu, Elokei Avos Yisrael, Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Asher Chalta Avos Yisrael. They can't say Avoseinu. There is that view, but that's not the halacha, right? So the question is, how in halacha can you justify a ger or a gioris in their davening saying something which is clearly not true on a daily, every time they bench? Right? And this guy didn't have, his avos didn't receive that bracha. How does that work? I don't know if you've ever discussed this or heard a shir on this topic. It's actually a very interesting topic. And it's something which a ger and a gioris is sometimes bothered by, right? Whether they are able to speak like that and how do they deal with it. But the bottom line is that in halacha, we follow, I think if I'm not mistaken, the view of Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rambam paskins this. It actually comes out interestingly in the Mishnah in Bikurim, because in Bikurim, when a farmer brings Bikurim, he has to bring his first fruits to the Kohen, right? That's one of the matnas kahuna. But then there's a second part of the mitzvah. What is the second part of the mitzvah? What does he have to do, the farmer, when he brings his Bikurim? Anybody know what he has to do? Any input here? What does the farmer have to do when he brings his basket full of olives? Or what does he say? A type of video. It's a mikra. What is he saying? Is mikra bikurim? What is he saying? Arami Oved Avi by Yerid Mitzrayim. He tells my story. It's in the first person, right? My father and we went down to Mitzrayim, and now I brought to you the fruits of the land that you promised to. But he's somebody from another nation. It's not true that his Rabbi Oved Ovi. It wasn't Ovi. Right? What does Ovi mean? So the Rambam says something very fascinating, and that is that the concept of Ovos and Imohos, where we normally think of it as a genetic connection, a biological connection of children of parents to children, also means something else completely. It means to be spiritual children of certain people. That Avram Avinu had every ger and giores is spiritually the child of Avram and Yitzchak, and these are the spiritual children, not the genetic, not the genealogical children, right? But because they have learnt from Avram Avinu. Rashi even says in one place that that's what the pasuk means in Sefer Devarim when it speaks about Klal Yisrael as Bonim Atem Lashem Elokeichem, that you are the children of God. In what sense are we the children of God? We're his children in the sense that we have learned his Torah and we follow his values and his commitments and his way of life. And in that sense, we are his children. Right? The minute we don't do that anymore, we're not anymore his children. Right? The children are the children who follow in the spiritual footsteps and the values of their parents. Not sure if I mentioned this, but in Megillas Rus, there's a very interesting indication of this in the opening psukim. Did I mention? Stop me if I mentioned this before in the share. I don't remember Megillas Rus, in the opening psukim of Megillas Rus, it starts off by saying that Nomin Elimelech, they went to Moab, who v'shnei bonov, the two sons. And then in the next pasuk it says he was there, Shnei bonov, right? And about three times it says that they went to Moab, and then together with their Shnei bonov, with their two sons. And then I think the third or fourth pasuk says that the sons married Noshim Moavios. They married out. They married non-Jewish girls. And in the next pasuk it says, "But Yishayahu," and she was a Mishnei Yelodov. It doesn't anymore call them her two sons. The text changes. The text of Megillas Rus changes from Shnei Bonov to Shnei Yelodov. So a Yeled is a biological relationship. A Yeled means a child to whom she had given birth. Bonov doesn't mean that. Bonov means a child who is following your value system and your way of life and your emunah, and is in a sense a follower, a spiritual follower. So when they went down together, Machlin B'Chilya was Shnei Bonov. As soon as they married out, they were no longer Shnei Bonov, they were Shnei Yelodov. They were her two offspring. They weren't anymore the two sons. Why do I say this? Because what it means is that when we speak about a ger or diores as a ben or bas Avraham, we mean this very seriously. That they are a ben Avraham, meaning because they've adopted the emunah and the chesed and the mitzvahs of Avraham Avinu, they are now his bonim, his children, right? And the children really, and that's what's in this covenant. So I wanted to mention this because I think it's a very important part of our hashkafa and our understanding of Sefer Bereshis. And it connects with so many different halachas as well. Halacha of Geirus, halacha of what Geirim can do and what they can say. Geirim are only allowed to daven with our siddur because we understand that Avram Avinu got the bris bein habesarim, and he was told in a sense, don't worry. In addition to being the father of the nation, we are also going to go into Galus and we're going to collect all the individuals from the Ummos HaOlam who want to join. We're not going to force anybody to join. Right? One of the amazing things about Jewish life that we've never been into encouraging non-Jews to join Klal Yisrael. On the contrary, we always discourage them. If any non-Jew comes and wants to convert, we first of all tell them, you know what? Not so easy to be a Yid. Not so easy. You've got to eat a lot of food, for example, right? As a Yid, you've got to eat non-stop, right? Every Shabbos and Yom Tov and Simchas and everything, you're eating round the clock. It's not so easy to be a Jewish person, right? It's trying. It's a hardship, right? And the details of life, etc. Baruch Hashem, we are living in a period of Chesed compared to the last couple of thousand years of Jewish life. We don't live in a life in a world where there are blood libels and persecutions and burnings of the stake and all the inquisitions and pogroms and everything and the Holocaust the previous generation had to suffer. But clearly over the millennia, being part of Klal Yisrael was a real suffering in the worst sense of the word and a tremendous deterrent for anybody wanting to join Klal Yisrael. There's no question about that. And yet there were Geirim and Geirises all the time because they were attracted like a magnet to Am Yisrael, and by being in the company of Klal Yisrael, and they seeing Klal Yisrael functioning the way they function, that is part of what we mean by living a life of a Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem means a dugma ishit, right? A role model where even a non-Jew sees it and thinks, wow, that's amazing. That is truly amazing. And that is a massive mitzvah. If we are able, first of all, to welcome and to be encouraging to people who have made that move, and also to be a role model for people who are interested to make that move, to learn with a ger or a geras who wants to. And I think I mentioned to you that I was in Tzfat for Shavuos. I went with my wife for a little mini break to Tzfat. It was extremely beautiful and very inspiring. And in one of the, I davened in lots of different shtibelach. There's one shtibel, which is the Tzanz shtibel, the Chernobyl shtibel, and the Belz shtibel, and the Lelov shtibel. And I went to as many as I could, just as a what should I call it? A spiritual tourist, maybe one could call that, just to have a look and see and to taste all these different experiences. In one of these shtibels, there was the main man of the minyan. There was a minyan of about 40, 50 people there. In one of these sort of things was a man with a beard and a Talmud Chacham, knowledgeable and everything. As it happened, I walked back with him afterwards, and he turned out to be an Englishman. Okay, I didn't think he was an Englishman. He didn't look like an Englishman, but he turned out to be an Englishman. Okay, so I started just having a conversation with him, and I said, well, where are you from? So he says, I'm from Ruislip, Middlesex. I thought, Ruislip, Middlesex? Doesn't sound like a place where there's a booming Jewish community in Ruislip, Middlesex. I don't know the place extremely well, but it's not on my map of UK Jewish communities. So I said, that's an interesting place to come to. How did you arrive here? Anyhow, I'll just cut to the bait of it. He says, I arrived here in my early 20s with total zero knowledge of anything about Judaism at all. It was the years after the Six-Day War, and just sounded like an interesting place to come to. For some reason, I won't go into now, he ended up in Tzfat, and in Tzfat he got very interested in what was spiritually going on in Tzfat, and he started getting a bit more interested in Jewish life. But he says, guess what? I arrived together with my non-Jewish wife. When I came here, I was married to a non-Jewish woman. And we came to Tzfat, the two of us. And as I started getting more interested in Jewish life, so did she. And at a certain point, she said to me, that's it. I'm going to go through the Geirus process. And she went through a very serious Haredi Bezdin that I know in Tzfat. And she went through about a year and a half or 2 years of a real learning curve process. She did it completely Lamahadrin, the whole Geirus process. And he said, as a part of it, he also had to learn, because the Bezdin were not willing to be Megayer her unless he convinced them that he was also completely Shema Mitzvahs. Anyhow, they went through this journey together, both of the geographical journey and then the spiritual journey. and she became a Gioris, and they raised their family together of B'nai Torah, and he's now got grandchildren, and he now runs one of the Tzfat Botei Midrashim very successfully from Ruislip, Middlesex, right? But he only became frum because of his wife. It was his wife who was really the driving force behind the Gerus, behind him becoming a Ben Torah and a Talmud Chacham. And you think to yourself, Rabbis Machshavos Belev Ish, he married a non-Jewish woman as a way out of Judaism, and this non-Jewish woman turned out to be his way in to Torah and mitzvahs, right? So this is a first-hand story that I heard just last week, which I found quite inspirational in a certain sense. And it's something which, if we learn the Chumash properly, and we see the covenants that Avraham Avinu gets, and particularly in Parshas Lech Lecha, we see that the bris milah was given to Avraham Avinu in order to mark out his uniqueness and his separateness from all the other nations of the world. That was the bris milah. But the bris bein habesarim was to tell him that even though he is unique, and Klal Yisrael will be am levodod yishka, will be separate and different from all the other nations, nevertheless, they're going to go into Galus and they will attract the Gerim and Gerises of all future generations, who will then be B'nai Avraham Avinu. And this is actually, I think, a very profound. So, on one sense, Tosfos actually says there in Yevamos, Tosfos says, this is a hardship for us, that we have to endure Galus just in order to attract these people. But on the other hand, this is a big zechus for Klal Yisrael, that we are able to attract a ger and a geres, even though there's only a handful. There's only a handful of authentic gerim and gereses. I think I mentioned to you last week that one of the big difficulties for every bezdin that's involved in giur, in conversion, is the knowledge that more than 50% of the people they convert will actually abandon Judaism and abandon mitzvahs within a short period of time. In other words, more than 50% of Gerim and Gerises are actually a short-lived experience for them. That is sadly a well-documented statistic. But those that do make it and really appreciate the Jewish life and connect to Klal Yisrael b'leiv u'b'nefesh, those Gerim and Gerises are a tremendous zechus for themselves and for Klal Yisrael. And one of the gifts that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us is that these people will join Klal Yisrael, and in a sense, that is the greatest simon, if you like, that we're doing something right. They're only joining us because they've witnessed a way of life which they want to participate in. And that is a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Every ger and every gieris is a tremendous Kiddush Hashem for Klal Yisrael, and in that sense, a tremendous zechus for us in every generation. That's it, Rabbi. I think that's it for today. I just wanted to go a little bit deeper into the covenants of Avraham Avinu, Parshas Lech Lecha, and what was really being said in these two covenants, the bris milah and the bris bein habesarim, and why it's relevant for us today and in every generation. That's it for today. Nice to see you all. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Unmute yourself.